Something happened to me while I was on my way home from a camping trip at East Park Reservoir in Colusa County, California, and it changed the way I see everything in this world. This was a trip that I had done with the same group of friends for 9 years in a row, so I knew the area really well and I had driven in and out of there many times. That year, I left camp a lot later than I normally would because one of our friends was moving to Europe and I didn't know when I'd see him again, so it was around 11 o'clock at night when I finally got out of there. I was by myself in my truck on Ladoga Sites Road, which I had been on plenty of times before. That road has a lot of sections where there is nothing around. No houses or farms or even other roads branching off. There's literally nothing but waist-high brush on both sides as far as you can see. It also gets extremely dark when the sun goes down, and that night I hadn't seen a single other person on the road the entire time. While I was driving, I came around this right-hand turn, and just as I came out of the corner, I saw a car pulled over on my side of the road. This was on one of the few spots anywhere out there where you can even pull off because it's a very narrow road and there's no shoulder at all. This car's headlights and taillights were on, and the driver's door was wide open so I could see inside because of the dome light. I slowed way down to probably 5 miles an hour, and as I got closer, I could see a woman standing in front of the car with her head tilted all the way back like she was staring straight up in the air. I could only guess that her car broke down, and since there's almost no cell service out there, I thought she might be trying to get her phone to catch a signal. It's definitely not a road you want car trouble on, especially at night, so I obviously had to help her. I pulled in and stopped about 20 feet behind her car and left my truck running with the lights on. Then I got out and started walking toward her. About halfway to her car, I asked if she needed help, but she didn't move and just stood there completely still. I walked a little farther until I was only a few feet from the back of her car, and I asked her again if she was okay and still got nothing. She had no reaction to me being there and didn't even move her head. That instantly gave me a bad feeling, so I started backing up toward my truck. I got right to the outside of my door and I was going to get in when this huge explosion of sound happened. This is a hard thing to explain because I don't know where it came from and there was no fire or light with it. There was just a shockwave of sound that knocked me off my feet, and I mean that literally. It physically blew me down to the ground. It felt like standing next to a bomb going off where the pressure alone could knock you out cold, and it nearly did that to me. I had tunnel vision and I was completely disoriented lying on the gravel next to my truck, and when I lifted my head up, I saw the most insane thing I've ever seen. In kind of a daze, I could still see this woman's car and her taillights, but in front of it was this intense column of light like a cylinder going straight up. It was extremely confusing because I was still trying to recover from getting knocked down, but I followed that light up with my eyes and saw her body floating in the middle of the air. She looked completely limp except for her arms, which were straight up above her head, and she was at least 15 feet off the ground and still going up higher. I couldn't process any of what I was seeing because it didn't look real, and I remember trying to push myself up with my bare hands on the gravel. As soon as I did that, my tunnel vision got even worse where everything started to go dark, and that's when I totally lost consciousness. I have no idea what happened. I only remember coming to and seeing the road in front of me, and I was perpendicular to it. I didn't know where I was or what I was even looking at for a second, and it took me some time to remember what had happened and that I was coming home from a camping trip. And this is crazy, but I was sitting upright against the front wheel of my truck with my knees up, and I think that's what my head was leaning on when I was out. Nothing made sense for several minutes, and it actually took me 5 or 10 to feel steady enough to stand up. When I felt more stable, I was able to get into the driver's seat, and that's where I stayed for a while trying to get my head on straight. It took a minute for everything to come back to me as far as the woman in her car and the explosion, but she and her car were both gone. I was on the side of the road alone and in the pitch dark. I drank an entire bottle of water while I sat there, and eventually I remembered everything. I knew exactly what had happened but had no way to explain any of it. As I felt more normal, my main concern became being out there by myself, so as soon as I felt good enough to drive, I left, and it was while I was driving that it really hit me. I had seen this woman who didn't even flinch when I yelled to her lift up into a beam of light. When I put that together, there was only one explanation I could think of. I had just watched an actual abduction happen right in front of me. The thought of that made me drive faster than anyone should ever go on that road, and I had to try so hard to stay calm until I got back to civilization. I can tell you that it changed everything I had ever believed in. I have kept this to myself since it happened, and it's been the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with mentally. I don't know who that woman was or what happened to her, but she and her car were both gone when I came to next to my truck. The only detail or clue I have is that she was driving a 2-door Toyota Solara, and I think it was silver. Other than that, I have nothing. I truly hate talking about this, and I try not to because it seems so made up and impossible. I wish I had never been there or seen any of it. I really don't like wondering about the woman and what might have happened to her, and I've lost a massive amount of sleep over that. I can only hope that if she really was taken, she never knew it and just drove away afterward. But that doesn't seem possible either because she would have seen me lying on the ground next to my truck. I will also admit that I was way too scared to go to the police or even call in anonymously. No one would ever believe a story like this, and I was mostly worried they'd turn it around like I had something to do with a missing woman in the middle of nowhere. So this is the first time I've ever talked about it, but I would still like to stay anonymous. I hate having to live with it every day, but hopefully some of your listeners can relate and will believe what I'm saying. I have had to cancel on the last 3 camping trips because of this, and I've never been back out there. I'm sure my friends think it's weird that I just quit going all of a sudden, but it was so horribly traumatic that I don't think I can anymore. This is an account of something that happened to me 2 separate times and about 11 years apart. My name is Pat, and when I was young, I lived in Clarion, Iowa until I was about 12. This is a very small town, but it's a nice community, and it was actually where the 4-H 4-leaf clover was created, if anyone wants to know that useless fact. When I was 8, my mom and dad took my sister and me to someone's house for a Super Bowl party. I don't remember whose house it was, but it was a pretty big party with several families and a lot of kids of all different ages. I knew some of them from school, although none of them were actually in my group of friends. We lived in Clarion proper in a regular house, but the place we were at was a massive farm property, and I remember there being a main house with a big red barn next to it, and that had a tall silo building behind it. We got there when it was light outside, but by the time the game was on, it was dark. While the adults were glued to the TV, most of the kids got restless, including me. Some stayed inside with the party, and some went outside to run around and play on the playset they had. We were really free to do whatever we wanted, and at some point I got bored, and being an adventurous kid, I went off to explore by myself. I ended up going over to the barn and cutting between the side of that and a big horse trailer that was parked next to it. Then I have a clear memory of going through 2 separate fences to get to the back of the barn where the silo was. This was February in Iowa, so it was cold and dark, but there were outdoor lights around the barn and I could see where I was going. When I got to the silo, I remember standing at the base of it, kind of marveling at how big it was and wondering what was inside. That's when I almost physically ran into 2 grown men. They seemed to show up out of nowhere because there was nothing else back there but another fence and a giant field behind the house that went on forever, and I hadn't even heard anyone opening gates or walking around. For some reason, I thought they were with the church because of how they were dressed. Both men were wearing dark suits with ties, and they looked almost identical to each other. They weren't twins in the face, but everything else about them matched, like the clothing and the height, and even the same short haircuts, which looked like something you'd see in the military. They were buzz cuts, and they both had light blonde hair. When I just about bumped into them, the one closest to me put his hand on my shoulder and asked where I was going. I didn't know if I was even allowed to be back there, and I thought I was in trouble, so I told him I just wanted to see the silo. Then the man who had his hand on my shoulder grabbed me under the arms and lifted me up onto the top rail of the fence, and I sat there and had a conversation with both of them. This is where my young memory fails me. I know I talked to them for a while, but I don't have any idea what we talked about. I have tried really hard to think about this over the years, but it just isn't there. The only thing I know is that my mom called my name from the back deck, then the same man helped me get off the fence and I went back in the house. Nothing else happened and I didn't go back outside again that night. I want to say that none of this scared me at the time and the two men didn't feel threatening in any way. After the fact, I assume they knew the homeowner and worked on the farm, and I never even mentioned it to anyone because it wasn't a big deal. It turned into something I remembered happening, but nothing I ever thought about. Right around the time I was 12 years old, we moved down to Des Moines, and I've lived here ever since. It was a big change from such a small town, but I like the city better. I really prefer more people around me and having more things to do. Moving forward into the future, when I was 19, I was working at Bebop's, and one night I was at the drive-thru window. Oddly enough, this was in February again, and it happened to be a super slow night. At one point, a car pulled up and I took an order for 2 large Pepsis and no food. When the car pulled up to the window, it was an older sedan, probably from the 80s, but in perfect condition, and there were 2 men inside wearing suits. Then when I got a good look at them, both the driver and the man in the passenger seat had the same short blonde hair. It was a little weird, but I didn't think about my past experience at first. I just handed them their drinks and they paid like any other customer. Then I told them to have a good night, and just before they drove off, the driver looked over at me and said, "It's good to see you again, Patrick." Then they drove away. I turned to my coworker who had been standing there the whole time and saw everything, and we both started laughing since it was such an unexpected thing to happen at work. It probably took me a full 30 seconds to realize and remember the 2 men from the farm in Clarion, but once it came back to me, I just about lost my mind. It was the same 2 men from behind the silo, and I couldn't have been more sure about that. It was difficult to even finish the last part of my shift, but I did tell my buddy at work the entire story from when I was a kid. It was unbelievable to me because that first encounter had happened over a decade earlier and roughly 90 miles away from Des Moines. There was no reason our paths should have ever crossed again, and I had no explanation for how they would have known my name unless they remembered it from when I was young. I think it's especially weird that they used my full name, Patrick, too, because I started going by Pat in high school. What I believe now is that I encountered what people refer to as men in black, or maybe some form of them. As a kid, it felt like they had walked right out of that huge field, and now I think that's exactly what happened. They also never told me who they were or why they were back there, at least not that I can remember. Then more than 10 years later and in a completely different location, they appeared again. And I don't know why they would have an interest in me, but it cannot be a coincidence. Since that night at the drive-thru, I can spot a man in a suit from a mile away. I've never seen those 2 men again, but I'm always aware of anyone dressed like that, and I feel like there's a possibility they could show up again. Actually, I feel a little stronger than that, and I almost expect them to someday. In 2018, my wife and I were outside together and had just finished an afternoon of yard work. We were both standing in our driveway when we saw this small light that looked just like a little star moving across the sky, but brighter. I thought it was a satellite since the sun was almost down and the sky was that dark blue, which made it easy to see, but she correctly said that it was way too low for that, and after watching it for a minute, it was obvious that she was right because it seemed to dip down like someone was flying a drone, and it went straight into the hill we live next to. We are in a pretty rural area where the smallest lots are about 10 acres, but there are other houses around us, and we both saw it come down near one of the houses on that hill. We really didn't give this a second thought because it could have easily been someone with a drone and they had just flown it back to land at their house. When I look back on it now though, we never heard anything at all, and it wasn't that far from our house. Later that night, we were watching TV with our 3 kids, one of whom was less than a year old at the time, and while we were in the living room, I could have sworn I saw a faint blue light shining through the cracks in the blinds and flickering on the wall, but I didn't say anything. Then my wife saw it and asked me what it was. It was right at this moment when I was getting out of my chair to look outside that everything went crazy. As soon as I stood up, one of the toys in our kids' room started going off randomly, and this startled us. Then in our living room, we have 2 big windows with curtains and blinds on them, and this blue light was now coming through both of them and flashing off and on like someone's bright headlights outside. I finally looked out the window closest to the front door, and out in our yard by a large oak tree, I could see the light. It was intensely bright, and it looked like someone was shining it at our house on purpose from behind the tree. Since I was looking directly into it though, there was no way I could see who or what was doing it. My wife started getting really nervous and got up to bring the kids together. Then our entire house lost power with the lights and the TV shutting off all at once. It actually gives me chills talking about this because I remember it so perfectly, and the only thing on my mind was a home invasion. After the power went out, all of us went into the kitchen to get away from the windows. All I could picture was someone kicking in the front door and coming into our house, so I got the .22 pistol and the bright LED flashlight that I kept in the cabinet by the back door and fumbled in the dark to get it ready. I remember sliding a fully loaded magazine in, and I was repeating this mantra in my head that I had to protect my family no matter what. I was terrified, but it helped me in the moment to at least pretend like I had the courage to deal with the situation. I decided to go out the back door so I could walk around the side of the house and hopefully see who was doing this without them knowing I was there. I had the gun ready to go, but I was uncontrollably shaking, and when I got to where I could see the oak tree from around the corner, I brought it up and aimed it, then turned the flashlight on. What I saw when that bright LED came on is something I can never get out of my head. If you've ever seen the way a cow's eyes reflect at night when a light hits them, that is what I saw. But these eyes were way too far apart to be human, and they were reflecting the light so brightly. I also realized there wasn't just one. There were 2 sets of eyes by the tree, and it looked like one was behind the other. I think there was even a 3rd set of eyes farther back in the woods, and that scared me the most because it was me against at least 3. I could barely make out the bodies these eyes were attached to, but I know for a fact they were standing upright, and the ones by the tree seemed taller than me. The second they saw me, they flashed that same ultra-bright blue light again, and it went right into my face. I instantly felt this burning sensation go all the way down my actual spinal cord from the back of my head to my tailbone. I feel like this feeling would be similar to getting tased by the police, even though I've never felt that, but my muscles and my body tensed up really hard from it, so that's what comes to mind when I think about it. When this happened, I pulled the trigger, and everything else is kind of a blur after that. I found out later that I had fired 8 rounds since I only had 2 left in the magazine, but most of what I shot went into the tree or into the air because my body had tensed up so badly. I also knew I hadn't hit any of these things in our yard because I watched them take off into the trees, and it was at an animal level speed. I could hear them blasting straight through branches and bushes like they were nothing. I have never had so much adrenaline run through my body at once, and all I really remember afterward is going back inside and sitting on our bed with my wife and kids. I ended up staying in the living room still armed for the rest of the night, watching the doors and windows, but it was completely quiet until morning. I debated calling the police because I would have felt so much better getting someone out there to check the property. I didn't know what I would even tell them since these things were absolutely not human beings. What I saw was so disturbing in an animal-like way, but they were up on 2 legs and stood taller than me. The reason I started this story with what we saw in the driveway is because my wife and I both think it had something to do with what came into our yard. We had dismissed it as a drone, but we've never seen any of our neighbors fly one, and it also hadn't made a sound as it came down into the hill. I did end up talking to a neighbor about this who lives 2 houses over from us, and he and his family didn't see or hear anything. He didn't even hear my .22 going off that many times in a row. We don't know what showed up at our house, but nothing has ever come back. It's still the scariest thing I've ever been through, and I don't ever want to deal with a situation like that again. But I will say this, if it does ever happen again, I've upgraded what we keep in the house for protection.